The wind howled like a dying animal against the timber walls, but the silence inside the cabin was far more deafening. She huddled in the dark, unable to scream, completely unaware that the towering stranger bleeding on the porch had just torn a grizzly apart with his bare hands just to keep her breathing. The Bitterroot Mountains of 1,887 did not forgive the weak, and they certainly held no mercy for a desperate woman fleeing on foot. Josephine Mercer's lungs burned with every ragged intake of sub-zero air, her breath crystallizing in the brutal twilight. She had been running since dawn, driven by the primal terror of the man riding hard behind her. Gideon Hayes was not a man who let his property simply walk away. He had won her in a rigged faro game down in Virginia City, a transaction her uncle had eagerly agreed to in exchange for clearing his debts. Josephine had known then that her only escape was into the unforgiving maw of the Montana wilderness. Her heavy wool skirt was a frozen, jagged bell around her ankles, heavy with ice and snagged with briars. The blizzard had descended rapidly, transforming the dense pine forest into a blinding white purgatory. She could no longer feel her toes, and the biting wind had long since stripped the sensation from her cheeks. But she could not stop. If Gideon, or his hired tracker, a ruthless half-breed named Ezra Chisholm, caught her, the snow would be a kinder death than what awaited her in a Gold Camp brothel. Through the dizzying whiteout, a square of unnatural symmetry broke the tree line. A cabin. It was a rugged structure, built of massive, unpeeled logs and chinked with mud and horsehair, tucked deep into the crook of a granite overhang. No smoke drifted from the stone chimney, but the sheer promise of shelter pulled Josephine forward like a lodestone. She stumbled onto the snow-drifted porch, her frozen fingers desperately clawing at the heavy oak latch. It was not locked. Josephine practically fell inside, slamming the heavy timber door shut against the howling tempest. The interior was pitch black and smelled overwhelmingly of wood smoke, dried tobacco, and raw leather. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the hard, uneven floorboards. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic, raspy wheeze of her own breathing. When her eyes finally adjusted to the gloom, she realized she was in the lair of a solitary predator. Animal pelts hung from the rafters, and an enormous Sharps buffalo rifle rested against a crude wooden table. Panic, fresh and sharp, spiked in her chest. This was no abandoned trapper's shack. Someone lived here, and in the Montana Territory, a lone man living this high on the ridge was often far more dangerous than the elements. She needed to hide. Josephine dragged her exhausted body toward the darkest corner of the room, wedging herself into the narrow gap between a massive cedar wardrobe and the stone hearth. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her trembling legs. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. She hadn't spoken to anyone in years. Trauma had stolen her voice when she was just a child, leaving her trapped in a world of profound, isolating silence. Now, that silence was her only shield. An hour passed. The storm outside escalated into a roaring frenzy, shaking the very foundations of the log cabin. Josephine had just begun to drift into the dangerous, warm lethargy of hypothermia when the heavy wooden door violently burst open. The wind shrieked, driving a flurry of snow into the room before the door was slammed shut by a massive buckskin-clad figure. The man was a Titan, his broad shoulders filling the entryway. He wore a thick wolfskin coat dusted in heavy white powder, and his face was obscured by a wild, unruly beard and the low brim of a battered Stetson. He dropped a bundle of firewood onto the floor with a deafening crash, muttering a low, gravelly curse as he struck a match against the table. The sudden flare of the oil lantern threw long, monstrous shadows against the walls. Josephine pressed her hand over her mouth, terrified that the violent hammering of her heart would give her away. The man, Wyatt Callahan, did not immediately notice her. He moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a man who had survived the horrors of the Civil War and chosen the wilderness over the company of his fellow man. Wyatt stripped off his sodden leather gloves, revealing hands scarred by frostbite and knife fights. He knelt by the hearth, just inches from the wardrobe where Josephine cowered, and began to build a fire. As the flames caught, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room, Wyatt froze. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. It was an instinct honed by a decade of living alongside wolves and mountain lions. He didn't turn around. His right hand drifted seamlessly to the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. He drew the weapon with a soft, metallic click that echoed through the quiet cabin. "I know you're there," Wyatt said. His voice was a deep, resonating rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Step out, slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." Josephine couldn't move. Paralyzed by a terror so profound it turned her blood to ice, she pressed tighter into the corner. Tears spilled hot and fast down her frozen cheeks. Wyatt stood in one fluid motion, the revolver leveled directly at the narrow gap. He took a heavy step forward, his boots loud against the wood. I said, "Come out." When there was no answer, Wyatt reached into the shadows and seized the dark wool of her cloak. He yanked hard, pulling Josephine sprawling onto the illuminated floorboards. She let out a silent, breathless gasp, scrambling backward like a cornered animal, her hands raised in a desperate plea for mercy. Wyatt stared, the heavy barrel of his Colt lowering slightly. He had expected a claim jumper, a thief, or perhaps a Blackfoot warrior. He had not expected a half-frozen woman with eyes the color of bruised violets, wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Her lips were cracked and blue, her skin pale as porcelain, and she was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his brow furrowing. Josephine opened her mouth, her throat working frantically, but no sound emerged. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, pointing to her throat and shaking her head again. Wyatt's grip on the revolver loosened completely. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a hunted thing. Slowly, deliberately, he holstered his weapon. "You can't speak," he murmured, the realization softening the hard lines of his weathered face. Josephine nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. She flinched as he took a step closer, expecting the back of his hand the currency of men like Gideon Hayes. Instead, Wyatt Callahan slowly crouched down, keeping his movements painfully deliberate, as if approaching a skittish doe. "You're freezing to death," he said softly, the gravel in his voice giving way to a quiet, undeniable authority. "I ain't going to hurt you. But if you don't get near that fire, you won't live to see morning." The fire snapped and popped in the hearth, throwing a halo of warmth against the biting chill of the cabin. Wyatt watched the woman from across the room, nursing a tin cup of bitter black coffee. She sat on a low wooden stool, wrapped in his heaviest buffalo robe, trembling as she sipped the hot rabbit broth he had forced into her hands. She was a ghost, he thought, a fragile, silent ghost blown in by the storm. "My name is Wyatt," he said, breaking the long silence. "Wyatt Callahan." The girl looked up, her violet eyes assessing him over the rim of the tin cup. She set the cup down, her fingers still stiff and awkward, and looked around the cabin. Her gaze landed on a piece of charcoal resting near the hearth, left over from when Wyatt mapped out his trapping lines on the floorboards. She pointed to it, then to herself. Wyatt nodded, intrigued. He kicked the lump of charcoal toward her. Josephine picked it up, her hand shaking, and carefully wrote on the smooth wood of the table, "Josephine." "Josephine," Wyatt read aloud. The name felt strange on his tongue, a relic of a civilized world he had abandoned a decade ago in St. Louis. "Who are you running from, Josephine?" A woman doesn't walk into the Bitterroots in November unless the devil himself is chasing her. Josephine's hand hesitated. She squeezed the charcoal so tightly it snapped. She quickly scribbled a single name. Gideon. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He knew the name. The valley below, near Stevensville, was thick with rumors of Gideon Hayes. He was a ruthless operator, a man who ran illicit whiskey and bought and sold desperate people like cattle to the mining camps. If Gideon was hunting her, he wouldn't stop at the foothills. He would send men up the mountain. "The snow will cover your tracks by dawn," Wyatt said, his tone flat and practical. "But you can't stay here. When the pass clears, I'm taking you down to Fort Owen. There's a stagecoach there that runs to Spokane. You'll be safe." Josephine looked at him, panic flashing in her eyes. She shook her head frantically, reaching out to grasp the coarse fabric of his sleeve. She wrote desperately, "He owns the sheriff. He owns the stage." Wyatt stared at the smudged black letters. He ran a rough hand over his beard, exhaling a long, weary sigh. "Then we have a problem, Josephine." For the next 3 days, the blizzard raged, imprisoning them within the 4 timber walls. A strange, silent domesticity settled over the cabin. Wyatt, a man accustomed to weeks without hearing his own voice, found himself oddly comforted by the mute woman's presence. Josephine was not idle. As her strength returned, she took over the small chores. She mended the tears in his flannel shirts with precise, delicate stitches. She baked hardtack biscuits using his meager flour rations, softening them with wild honey. They communicated in gestures, expressions, and charcoal scrawls. Wyatt found himself watching the way the firelight caught the auburn strands of her hair, the quiet grace of her movements. He had built this cabin to escape the world, to forget the blood on his hands from the war. But now, the world had intruded, and he was surprised to find he didn't want to turn it away. But the wilderness is a jealous master, and danger was closing in from 2 fronts. Down in the valley, inside the smoky, gin-soaked confines of the Stevensville saloon, Gideon Hayes slammed a heavy fist onto the wooden bar. He was a sharply dressed man with cold, dead eyes and a silver-tipped cane he used more for striking than walking. "Are you telling me," Gideon hissed, leaning over the bar toward a sweating Ezra Chisholm, "that a mute girl in a wool dress outran my best tracker?" Ezra, a hardened man missing half his left ear, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the sawdust floor. The storm wiped out the trail at the tree line, Mr. Hayes. But she went up the ridge, toward the high passes. Only one man lives up there, Wyatt Callahan. Gideon's eyes narrowed. The mountain man. The one who shot 3 Pinkertons in Virginia City over a card game? "The very same," Ezra muttered. "He's a ghost, boss. You go up there, you're walking into his graveyard." "I don't care if he's the Grim Reaper himself," Gideon sneered, tossing a heavy leather coin purse onto the bar. "Gather 5 men, heavily armed. We ride up as soon as the storm breaks. I want my property back, and I want Callahan's scalp." High above the valley, unaware of the armed posse gathering below, Wyatt was dealing with a different kind of monster. On the 4th morning, the snow stopped. The world was blindingly bright, silent, and deadly cold. Wyatt strapped on his snowshoes and took his Sharps rifle to check his snare lines, leaving Josephine locked safely inside the cabin. Less than a mile from his front door, Wyatt found the carcass. It was a massive bull elk, easily weighing 800 pounds. But it hadn't been killed by wolves or the cold. It had been ripped apart. The rib cage was shattered. The spine snapped like a dry twig. Wyatt knelt in the snow, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He traced the massive tracks leading away from the slaughter. The paw prints were the size of dinner plates, the indentations of 5 massive, razor-sharp claws digging deep into the frozen earth. It was a grizzly, but not just any grizzly. The spacing of the tracks indicated a beast of monstrous proportions, an old rogue male that hadn't gone into hibernation. Starving, desperate, and driven mad by the freezing temperatures, the bear was actively hunting in his territory. Wyatt stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the dense, snow-laden pines. The hair on his arms stood straight up. The wind shifted, and for a fleeting second, he caught the foul, rotting stench of wet fur and old blood. The beast was close, and its tracks were heading directly toward the log cabin. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's blade, pierced Wyatt's chest. He did not waste breath on curses. He simply turned and ran. The snowshoes, usually a graceful tool for gliding over the drifts, felt like lead weights as he drove himself back up the incline toward the granite overhang. His lungs burned, pulling in air so frigid it tasted like iron, but he pushed his muscular frame to the absolute limit. He knew the nature of a starving grizzly. It would not bother tracking a fast, healthy elk when it could smell the rich, fatty scent of bacon grease and horsehair chinking wafting from a stationary log cabin. It was hunting the easiest meal available. It was hunting Josephine. Inside the cabin, Josephine was completely oblivious to the nightmare hurtling toward her. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing red embers, casting a soft, comforting twilight across the room. She was at the heavy wooden table, her small hands kneading a fresh batch of sourdough, enjoying the rare sensation of safety. For the first time in her 22 years, she felt a profound, undeniable sense of peace. The violent, bruising world of men like Gideon Hayes felt a million miles away, blocked out by the thick timber walls and the quiet strength of the mountain man who had sheltered her. Then, the horses began to scream. Wyatt kept 2 sturdy mustangs in a small, reinforced lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. Their sudden, high-pitched shrieks of pure, unadulterated terror shattered the silence. Josephine dropped the doe, her heart leaping into her throat. She stumbled backward, the stool clattering to the floor. The heavy timber walls of the cabin shuddered violently, followed by a deafening, splintering crash from the lean-to. A shadow fell over the front window. It was not the shadow of a man. It was impossibly broad, blocking out the glare of the morning sun entirely. Josephine scrambled toward the darkest corner, her back hitting the cold stone of the hearth. She pulled her knees to her chest, her entire body seized by violent tremors. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the floorboards, a sound so deep and powerful it rattled the tin cups on the shelves. On the porch, the grizzly reared up on its hind legs. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, a mountain of scarred muscle, matted silver-tipped fur, and pure ravenous fury. It slammed its massive front paws against the oak door. The heavy iron hinges shrieked in protest. Wood splintered. The beast roared, a terrifying, deafening sound that echoed off the canyon walls, and struck the door again. Josephine pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She was trapped. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the door to give way, waiting for the jaws of the monster to find her in the dark. "Hey!" The shout rang out from the tree line, cutting through the roar of the bear. Wyatt burst into the clearing, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with desperate fury. He dropped to one knee in the deep snow, bringing the heavy Sharps buffalo rifle to his shoulder in one fluid motion. He didn't have time to aim properly. He just needed to draw the monster away from the door. He pulled the trigger. The rifle boomed like a cannon, kicking hard against his shoulder. A cloud of black powder smoke engulfed him. The massive lead slug caught the grizzly in the thick muscle of its left shoulder. The bear let out an ear-splitting bellow of pain and rage, dropping to all fours. It spun around, its tiny, cruel eyes locking onto the solitary figure kneeling in the snow. It forgot about the cabin. It forgot about the horses. With astonishing speed for a creature of its immense size, the grizzly charged Wyatt, tearing up huge clods of snow and frozen earth with every stride. Wyatt threw the empty rifle aside. There was no time to reload. He drew his heavy Colt revolver, steadying his breathing as the mountain of fur and muscle bore down on him. 10 yards. 5 yards. He fanned the hammer, firing 3 rapid shots directly into the bear's broad chest. The bullets punched into the beast, but a grizzly's skull and chest cavity are built like armor plating. The momentum carried the monster forward. Before Wyatt could fire a fourth shot, the bear was upon him. A massive paw, tipped with claws the size of railroad spikes, swiped through the air. The blow struck Wyatt's right side, shattering his ribs and sending him flying through the air like a rag doll. He crashed hard into the base of a massive pine tree, his vision exploding into a constellation of white-hot stars. His revolver spun away into the deep snow, lost. The bear loomed over him, its jaws snapping, hot saliva dripping onto Wyatt's face. The stench of rotting meat was overpowering. Inside the cabin, Josephine heard the gunfire, followed by the sickening thud of a heavy impact, and then a terrifying, agonizing struggle. She didn't know what was happening, only that the man who had saved her was fighting for his life. Trembling uncontrollably, she forced herself to stand. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white, and crept toward the window. Outside, Wyatt was fighting a losing battle. The bear lunged, its massive jaws closing around his left thigh. Wyatt screamed, a raw primal sound of agony. Instinct took over. He reached down to his boot and drew his 10-inch hunting knife, a blade forged from a heavy steel file. As the bear reared back to deliver a crushing bite to his neck, Wyatt thrust upward with every ounce of strength he had left, driving the blade deep into the soft hollow beneath the grizzly's jaw, burying it to the hilt. Hot, dark blood erupted over Wyatt's hand. The bear stiffened, a gurgling roar dying in its throat, before its massive weight collapsed directly on top of him, pinning him to the blood-soaked snow. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the wind. Josephine pushed the splintered door open. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she didn't stop. She waded through the knee-deep snow, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the horrific tableau. The monster was dead, but Wyatt was trapped beneath it, unmoving, the snow around him turning a sickening crimson. She fell to her knees beside him, her trembling hands desperately shoving against the unyielding bulk of the dead bear. She couldn't move it. Panic gave way to fierce, adrenaline-fueled determination. Using a broken tree branch as a lever, she wedged it under the bear's shoulder and pushed with all her might. Slowly, agonizingly, the carcass shifted just enough. Josephine grabbed Wyatt by the collar of his blood-soaked wolfskin coat and dragged him out from under the beast. He was unconscious, his face deathly pale, his side and leg mangled and bleeding profusely. She did not scream. She did not cry. The mute girl who had cowered in the corner just moments ago had vanished. In her place was a woman who realized that if this man died, she died with him. She wrapped her arms under his shoulders and began the agonizing task of dragging his heavy, broken body back into the sanctuary of the log cabin. The interior of the cabin smelled of copper blood, burning pine, and iodine. 3 days had passed since the grisly attack, and Wyatt Callahan was clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. He lay on his narrow cot, shivering violently despite the 3 heavy buffalo robes piled on top of him. The fever had taken hold. Josephine had not slept. She moved around the small space with the grim efficiency of an army surgeon. She had boiled snow in a cast-iron kettle, using the scalding water to clean the deep, jagged lacerations on his thigh and ribs. Using a bone needle and thick sinew she found in his trapping kit, she had meticulously stitched his torn flesh back together. She poured raw whiskey directly into the wounds, wiping away the sweat that beaded on his forehead as he thrashed and groaned in his delirium. In his fever dreams, Wyatt was back in the war. He muttered names of dead men, shouted orders to phantom cavalry, and occasionally he called out a name that made Josephine pause. McParland. James McParland, the famous Pinkerton detective. Wyatt had muttered about a train robbery in Missouri, a setup, and a desperate escape. It was a fragmented confession of a past life, a secret history he had buried in the mountains. Josephine listened silently, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, realizing that the rugged mountain man was just as haunted, just as hunted as she was. On the 4th night, the fever finally broke. Wyatt opened his eyes. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth. His body felt as though it had been run over by a freight train, every muscle screaming in protest as he tried to shift his weight. He looked down and saw his chest and leg heavily bandaged with torn strips of cotton. He turned his head. Josephine was asleep in the wooden chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms crossed over the edge of his mattress. Her auburn hair was a tangled mess, her pale face smudged with soot and dried blood. She looked exhausted, fragile, and undeniably beautiful. Wyatt slowly reached out, his calloused, scarred hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. Josephine woke instantly. She bolted upright, her violet eyes wide with alarm, until she saw him looking at her. The relief that washed over her face was palpable. A small, trembling smile broke across her lips, and tears welled in her eyes. "You stayed," Wyatt rasped, his voice barely a whisper, dry as dust. "You saved my life." Josephine reached for her piece of charcoal and the small slab of wood she kept nearby. She wrote quickly, "You fought a monster for me. I owe you my life." Wyatt read the words, his heart tightening. "The bear was just hungry," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "But the real monsters are still out there." He was right. 5 miles below the timberline, Gideon Hayes was freezing, furious, and losing his patience. His expensive leather riding boots were entirely unsuited for the brutal Montana snowdrifts. His posse of 5 hardened cutthroats, led by the wary tracker Ezra Chisholm, trudged miserably up the steep, winding mountain trail. "How much further, Chisholm?" Gideon snapped, pulling his thick wool collar up against the biting wind. "If I lose another toe to the frost, I'm taking it out of your hide." Ezra stopped, crouching low in the snow. He brushed aside a layer of fresh powder, revealing a faint, elongated indentation. "We're close, Mr. Hayes." The storm hid the trail, but the geography only leaves one path up to the granite overhang. Callahan's cabin is less than a mile up this ridge. One of the hired guns, a vicious, scarred man named Hiram Lodge, spat a stream of tobacco onto the pristine snow. "I hear this. Callahan is a ghost." Here's a twig snap from a mile away. "We go stomping up there. He'll pick us off before we even see the chimney." "He's a man," Gideon sneered, his cold eyes devoid of fear. "He bleeds like any other man. Spread out. We approach from the tree line. I want the girl alive. You can do whatever you want with Callahan." Up at the cabin, the morning sun broke over the jagged peaks, casting long, sharp shadows across the clearing. Wyatt was attempting to sit up, his teeth gritted in agony as the stitches pulled tight against his skin. He needed to check his rifle. He needed to be ready. The silence of the mountain felt heavy, oppressive, like the air before a lightning strike. Josephine was at the window, peering out through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. She was watching the tree line. Suddenly, her breath hitched. She spun around, her eyes wide with sheer terror, and began waving her hands frantically at Wyatt. She grabbed her charcoal and scribbled a single panicked word on the wood. "Men." Wyatt's blood ran cold. He forced himself upright, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs, and limped heavily toward the window. He peered through the crack. At the edge of the clearing, standing over the massive, frozen carcass of the grizzly bear, were 6 armed men. Ezra Chisholm was kneeling by the bear, examining the knife wound under its jaw, his face pale with disbelief. Gideon Hayes stood behind him, a sleek Winchester repeating rifle resting over his shoulder, his eyes fixed dead on the cabin door. "They found us," Wyatt whispered, his grip tightening on the windowsill. He turned to look at Josephine. She was shaking violently, clutching the heavy iron poker like a child holding a toy sword against an invading army. Wyatt hobbled over to the table and picked up his heavy Colt revolver, checking the cylinder. He only had 5 rounds left. His Sharps rifle was empty, leaning uselessly in the corner. He was half dead, bleeding, and outnumbered 6 to 1 by ruthless killers. "Josephine," Wyatt said, his voice calm, dropping an octave to convey absolute authority. He limped toward her, taking her trembling hands in his own. "Listen to me very carefully. You are going to hide in the root cellar under the floorboards. You do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Josephine shook her head frantically. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She grabbed his arm, refusing to let go, refusing to be hidden away while he died for her. "I can't fight them all like this," Wyatt admitted, the harsh truth hanging heavy in the air. "But I can make them pay for every inch of this cabin." Outside, Gideon's voice echoed across the frozen clearing, dripping with arrogant malice. "Callahan!" Gideon shouted, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I know you're in there. I'm a reasonable man. Send the girl out, and we ride away. You keep your miserable life, and I get my property. You have 60 seconds to open that door, or we burn you both alive." Inside, Wyatt looked at Josephine. The mute girl looked at the empty Sharp's rifle, then at Wyatt's bloody bandages, and finally, her gaze hardened into something terrifying and resolute. She wasn't running anymore. She walked over to the corner, picked up the heavy buffalo rifle, and shoved it into Wyatt's hands. Then, she pulled a heavy canvas sack of black powder from the shelf. They were going to fight. The heavy canvas sack of black powder hit the wooden table with a soft, ominous thud. Wyatt stared at the mute woman, a profound respect warring with the sheer terror of their situation. Josephine did not hesitate. Her hands, though trembling, moved with fierce purpose. She grabbed an empty cast-iron Dutch oven from the hearth, unscrewed the brass horn of the powder flask, and began pouring the coarse, volatile black grains into the heavy iron pot. She gestured frantically to his leather tool satchel resting by the wood stove. Wyatt understood instantly. "Shrapnel," he breathed, a grim, blood-stained smile touching the corners of his mouth. He limped heavily to the corner, dragging a wooden crate filled with bent horseshoe nails, broken glass, jagged iron filings, and heavy lead fishing weights. He dumped the lethal assortment directly into the powder. It was a crude, devastating explosive, a horrific tactic he hadn't seen since the bloody siege of Vicksburg under General Ulysses S. Grant. Outside, Gideon's patience had evaporated. "Burn them out!" His voice roared over the howling wind. "Leave nothing but ashes!" Wyatt tore a long strip of cotton from his ruined shirt, soaking it thoroughly in kerosene from the oil lantern, and buried one end deep into the black powder mixture. He shoved the heavy iron pot just behind the splintered front door, trailing the kerosene-soaked rag back toward the stone hearth where Josephine crouched. He handed her a single sulfur match. "When I say the word Josephine," Wyatt rasped, cocking the hammer of his heavy Colt revolver, his eyes locking onto her violet gaze, "you strike it, turn your face to the stone, and cover your ears. Do not look back." Josephine nodded once, her jaw set. Striking the match against the stone, the tiny sulfur flame hissed, casting a dancing, fragile light across her soot-stained face. A hail of lead suddenly erupted from the tree line. 5 Winchester repeating rifles opened fire simultaneously, the deafening roar shattering the mountain silence. Bullets tore through the wooden shutters, shattering the glass and sending lethal splinters of oak and pine flying through the cabin. The heavy iron stove rang out like a grim church bell as slugs ricocheted off its surface. Wyatt ducked low, shielding Josephine with his broad, battered body as the cabin was systematically chewed to pieces. Heavy boots pounded onto the wooden porch. Hiram Lodge, the scarred gunman, kicked the already splintered door. It gave way with a sickening crack, hanging loosely on its bottom hinge. Hiram stepped into the gloom, his rifle raised, squinting through the dust and smoke. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He raised his Colt and fired a single round. The heavy slug caught Hiram square in the chest, throwing the man backward off the porch into the blood-stained snow. "They're out of powder," Ezra Chisholm yelled from the yard, misinterpreting the solitary pistol shot. "Rush the door! Get the girl!" Footsteps thundered across the porch timbers. 3 men, led by Ezra, converged on the narrow entryway, their weapons drawn, confident that the crippled mountain man was out of options. Wyatt looked at Josephine. "Now," he roared. Josephine touched the burning match to the kerosene-soaked cloth. The fuse hissed fiercely, a bright blue flame racing across the floorboards toward the Dutch oven. Wyatt threw his arms around Josephine, burying her against his chest and pressing them both flat against the cold stone of the hearth. The explosion was apocalyptic. The cast-iron pot detonated with the concussive force of a cannon shell. A blinding flash of orange fire vaporized the front wall of the cabin. The sheer shockwave blew the roof timbers upward, while thousands of jagged nails, glass shards, and iron filings tore through the doorway at supersonic speed. Ezra Chisholm and the 2 hired guns were caught directly in the blast radius. They were thrown backward into the clearing, their bodies shredded by the improvised shrapnel, dead before they ever hit the snow. Inside, a terrifying, ringing silence followed the deafening roar. Thick, acrid black smoke choked the air. Wyatt groaned, his ears bleeding from the pressure, his broken ribs screaming in agony. He pushed himself up on one arm, desperately checking the woman beneath him. Josephine was coughing, covered in dust and soot, but miraculously unharmed. Before they could stand, a tall, impeccably dressed silhouette stepped through the gaping, smoking ruin of the doorway. Gideon Hayes had survived by hanging back near the tree line, letting his men do the dirty work. His expensive coat was dusted with ash, his cold eyes burning with a psychotic, unrestrained fury. He stepped over the mangled remains of Ezra Chisholm, his Winchester rifle raised and pointed directly at Wyatt's head. "You ruined my investment," Gideon spat, racking the lever of his rifle. "And you slaughtered my men. I am going to gut you like a fish, Callahan, and make her watch." Wyatt was out of bullets, his Colt buried somewhere in the rubble. He tried to lunge forward, but his mangled leg gave out, sending him crashing to his knees. Gideon smiled, a cruel, triumphant sneer, and aimed down the sights. He never saw the shadow move behind him. Josephine had crept through the blinding smoke, gripping the heavy, empty Sharps buffalo rifle by its heated steel barrel. With a silent, feral scream, she swung the 10-pound wooden stock like a baseball bat. The heavy walnut stock connected with the back of Gideon's skull with a sickening, wet crack. The wealthy tyrant's eyes rolled back in his head. His rifle discharged wildly into the ceiling as his knees buckled, sending him collapsing face first onto the ruined floorboards, unconscious and bleeding heavily. Wyatt didn't wait for him to wake up. He drew his hunting knife and dragged himself across the floor, driving the blade deep into Gideon's chest, ending the monster's reign of terror permanently. The wind howled through the destroyed cabin, blowing the smoke out into the cold morning air. Wyatt collapsed backward, gasping for breath, his hands covered in blood. Josephine dropped the shattered rifle and fell to her knees beside him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her silent tears soaking into his ruined coat. Wyatt held her tight, his hands stroking her auburn hair. They were broken, battered, and freezing, but they were alive. Records from the territorial governor, Benjamin F. Potts, would later state that Gideon Hayes vanished in the winter of 1887, his criminal empire crumbling in his absence. And in 1889, Pinkerton director William Pinkerton officially closed the file on Wyatt Callahan, declaring the fugitive dead. But high in the Bitterroot Mountains, hidden away from the cruelty of the civilized world, a mountain man and a mute woman rebuilt a log cabin, forging a legendary life born from blood, snow, and an unbreakable, silent love. The legend of the mute girl and the wild mountain man who defeated a monster and a tyrant still echoes through the Bitterroot Mountains. Their story proves that the fiercest love and undeniable courage are often forged in the cruelest winters. If you were captivated by Josephine and Wyatt's incredible fight for survival, please hit that like button. Share this thrilling Wild West romance drama with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life historical stories.
Hi, my name is Ensley Rowland, the owner and manager of Air Encounters. After watching the video, Mute Girl trembled inside the log cabin, not knowing the wild mountain man fought a bear for her. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of protection and quiet devotion. The story highlights how powerful actions can be, especially when they come from someone who asks for nothing in return. Watching courage and compassion unfold in such a difficult situation made the story both emotional and memorable. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that care is often shown through what we do, not just what we say. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones willing to stand up for others when it matters most. In our everyday lives, even small acts of support can help someone feel safer and less alone. What moment touched you the most? And do you think the mountain man's actions changed the way the girl saw herself, as well as the world around her? Thank you for spending time with Air Encounters. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe like or subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this.